Great. Thanks so much, Lindsay. I really appreciate the invitation. I have to tell you guys, this is my favorite conference during the year because, I'm right down the street from all of you, relatively speaking, wherever you are in Minnesota. I'm in Bloomington, just so you know where I am at. And it's just always nice to talk to people from my home state. So as we go along today, I only have 45 minutes. I have a lot of really good information. I could talk about accommodations for hours and hours because it's near and dear to my heart. But if I don't get to your question, or if there are things that you think about after the fact and think, oh gosh, I wish I would have asked Debbie this or that, at the very end of the slides, I will have my personal email address. You are welcome as participants today to email me directly. I just do ask if you have candidates or advocates, people in your program that have accommodation questions. The accommodation box is also on that last slide. If you would please ask them to email that box. My team works in that box all day long and they will get a response to you. But I would love to hear from you directly if you have any questions. So today we're going to talk about disability categories, the accommodation process, most importantly, the best ways that you can assist your candidates that need accommodations. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for questions. I will also stop a couple of times during the presentation, and my colleague and good friend, Melissa, will help me with any questions. So make sure you populate the chat with any questions you have as we go along. And thank you for being here today. So just a little bit of an overview. The purpose of accommodations is to level the playing field. It is not a guarantee of improved performance. It is just to allow candidates to have access to the test. The accommodation requests that people send in are considered on a case-by-case basis. There is not such a thing on my team as saying, oh, okay, we're going to put all the ADHD requests over in this pile and we're going to handle those all the same way. Most candidates do not have a single disabling condition. They almost without exception have some kind of comorbidity. That means that they might have ADHD, but oh, guess what? They have a learning disability in math as well. So we would take all of that into consideration when we review their request for accommodations. The last one we will talk about more as we go along, appropriate documentation. There does have to be documentation to support the request. And we'll talk more about that because I know sometimes that is difficult for our adult students to get the documentation they need to be able to apply. So we bucket the accommodations sort of in standard buckets. Most testing agencies do. The first category is candidates who have learning and other cognitive disabilities, SLD it's sometimes called. Generally, candidates with a learning disability will have a psychoeducational report or some sort of a report with IQ and achievement scores. We look for that report to be within the last 5 years. Now, that being said, on all of these guidelines and times, if it's 6 years old, don't say to your candidate, no, I'm sorry, it's too old, they're not going to accept it. Send it in and let our team take a look. For certain disabling conditions, if it's 6 or 7 years old, yes, we're going to allow that. I will say there are limits. So if your candidate's documentation is 10 years old, or it was done when they were in the 2nd grade and it's 7 or 8 years old, we are going to ask for updated documentation, mostly because It's not that their disability has changed, but their functional limitations most certainly have changed over time. And we're looking for their current functional limitations. So sometimes that will mean that what accommodations were suggested for them way back when they received that testing and got a report may not be enough for them in the current situation taking the GED exam. And we want to make sure that we provide all the accommodations that are necessary for them to be able to access that test. Okay. So the next category is ADHD, sometimes ADD, so attention deficit disorder. Again, the documentation needs to be from within the last 5 years. Sometimes we'll see that on a psych report. Sometimes it's just a letter from a medical professional that can make that diagnosis, and that letter on the professional's letterhead, dated and signed, with the diagnosis and the current functional limitations, that would likely be enough documentation for the candidate to be eligible for some accommodations. The next category is psychological and psychiatric disorders. We do ask for that documentation to be within the last year. And the reason we do that is because those conditions can change quickly over time. Some of them don't, but many of them can. So again, if your candidate is not being seen regularly by a psychologist, but they have a psychological condition, their documentation is 2 or 3 years old, please send it to the team. Let my reviewers take a look. If additional updated documentation is needed, they'll write back and tell the candidate and their advocate what additional information is needed. But I would say many of the candidates who have a condition that's psychological or psychiatric are being seen on a regular basis by a doctor. And so hopefully a letter from that certifying professional will not be difficult to get. Again, let me just say again, the documentation should be on the doctor's letterhead, signed and dated. It's surprising to us how many doctors send letters and they don't put a date on it. I don't know. I date everything that I do. It seems like it should be standard practice, but make sure to ask the doctor to have signed and dated so that we know when that was submitted. The last category is physical disorders and chronic health. Again, we ask for that documentation to be within the last year because many of those conditions can change quickly over time, right? Someone needs a scribe to take their test right now because perhaps they have a broken arm. That broken arm will heal. So if they have to continue testing next year, they will not need to have a scribe. Hopefully, their arm has healed. The exception to this, of course, would be someone that has a permanent disability, like someone who is blind or significant visual impairment. Those candidates, my brother is legally blind, and I mean, I know from him, he doesn't go to the eye doctor every year. Why would he go to the eye doctor? He is blind. So for candidates with those kinds of physical disability, whatever documentation they have them send that in, and it is very likely exactly what we need to be able to approve accommodations for them. Okay. So just quickly, what is not considered a disability? There's a couple on here that come up frequently that I want to talk about. The first one is this top left, ESL, or English as a second language, or ELL, however you guys refer to it. The ADA does not consider not being a native English speaker as being a disability. So accommodations cannot be granted because of that. However, I encourage you to talk with your candidate to see if there are other things going on that maybe we could provide accommodations for them. For example, we have seen candidates that have some sort of a TBI, or they've had some sort of trauma in their life. And that can be enough with a write-up from a doctor to give them some extra time. So my encouragement here is don't stop at, oh, your ESL. Well, sorry, we can't give extra time for you for ESL because that's not allowed. Ask those probing questions. Are there other conditions or situations? Do you have some sort of a medical disability that we could get documentation for that might allow them to get extra time? Do they have maybe a vision issue? This is often the time when I talk about a candidate that I worked with, and her mother, and she had a learning disability, but she did not have current documentation. And I was trying so hard to help them and was going back and forth. And one day when I was talking with the mom said something about her daughter's one eye. And I'm like, wait a minute, your daughter only has one eye? Well, yeah. Well, I encouraged her to go to her daughter's eye doctor and get a letter that described the difference in the field of vision her daughter had because she only had one eye. And that allowed us to approve extra time for her daughter, which was what she was trying to do all along, but she was trying to do that by a learning disability. So probably the big tip of the day is course of least resistance. So again, I'll say that course of least resistance. It can be very expensive and time consuming to get a psychological report, but there may be other things going on in the test taker's life that would allow them to get maybe a letter from their doctor that would be enough documentation, maybe a small cost or no cost at all, and we could move forward with particularly things like just some extra time. So just keep that in mind when you're working with your candidates. I think you've seen already, our goal is to be able to provide accommodations for your students. We are not about trying to say no. We are trying to give all of your candidates the tools and the time that they need to be able to access the test. Okay. The other one I just want to mention quickly here is test anxiety. I don't know. I think we all have test anxiety, right? I know I can raise my hand and say, oh yes, when I have taken high stakes tests as an adult, oh my goodness, kind of catches me off guard how nervous I get. So we all, or many of us, get test anxiety, but under the ADA, test anxiety is not a disabling condition, but generalized anxiety is. So I would encourage you to have your student go to their doctor and talk about a diagnosis of generalized anxiety. So the doctor would work with them and determine under what circumstances are they anxious. Are they anxious at the grocery store? Are they anxious when they drive their car? Are they anxious in large groups of people? There are a whole lot of questions that the doctor can work with the candidate to determine if they can get a diagnosis of generalized anxiety. And if they can, and again, the doctor writes that note signed and dated on letterhead with a diagnosis of generalized anxiety and a recommendation for extra time, there we go. We have just what we need. Okay. I'm going to go to the next slide, but Melissa, should I stop for a moment or are we okay?
I think you're okay to go ahead. I mean, within 7 minutes of you presenting, we've already got comments that this is already helpful and you're giving great advice. So I think you can go continue.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. So next slide, we get the question a lot of times. So can you send me a list of all the accommodations that are available for the GED test? The answer to that question is no. And the reason the answer is no is because we will consider any request that a test taker sends in. So it is impossible to create a list. We, just when we would think we have a whole list, somebody would say, well, what about this? Or what about that? So we do not have a list. We ask test takers to tell us what accommodations they feel they need to access the test. And then often we have an interactive dialogue with them about, we might not be able to do a certain thing, but we might be able to do something else. For example, there are test takers where the overhead lights bother them. And it is possible to ask to have the lights off in the testing room. Well, there are not a lot, I won't say very few, but there are not a lot of test centers where they have a separate room on a separate light switch to be able to turn those lights off. If we can't find that kind of a room for a candidate, then we talk with the candidate, would it be possible for them to wear sunglasses and a visor to mitigate the glare of those overhead lights? It's something like that that just can make the difference and allow the candidate to be able to test a reasonable distance from their home and yet be able to be comfortable while they're testing. So just an example there. I will run through the most commonly requested ones here. The first one I'll talk about is extra time. On the GED test, candidates can request 25, 50, or 100% extra time. If the candidate and their professional just say candidate needs extra time, then my reviewer will read the report and make a determination. Generally, we gravitate to the middle of the road. If there isn't a recommendation, we almost always do 50% time. The 100% time we use a lot with candidates who have the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is a reader or a recorder. So a reader will read the test items to the candidate. A recorder enters them into the computer in real time, or in the case of, for example, a candidate who is blind, the person would need a reader recorder, right? One person that does both functions. So it can either be doing one of the functions or doing both of the functions together. We always approve those requests with 100% extra time and breaks, which is the next thing we'll talk about here, at 45 minutes with a 10-minute break. It's just so much active listening on the part of the candidate. And I have had to read a test before. You, as a reader, you need a rest, take a drink of water, just sort of sit back for a few minutes. So we do it for the reader as well, but it allows the test taker to have a comfort break, to kind of have their mind free flow for a couple of minutes and then get back into listening mode. So stop the clock breaks, I've already mentioned 45 minutes of testing and a 10-minute break. There is also 30 minutes of testing with a 5-minute break. And then separate room. These are for candidates who sometimes have a piece of equipment or technology that requires that. Sometimes they have a medical condition that requires that. For example, there are candidates who have Tourette's syndrome. If you're not familiar with that, those candidates have involuntary either movements or speech. They can't help it. It just happens. While they're sitting, it can be made even worse when they're in a stressful situation. So for their comfort and privacy, as well as for the privacy of the people around them, we always would put that kind of a candidate in a separate room so that they're comfortable and not disturbing others at the same time. So there are multiple reasons why we would approve a separate room. Let me take just a minute and talk about on-view testing. So the GED test is available for candidates to take online. Accommodations are available for those candidates as well when they test online. Okay. So documentation guidelines. Lindsay told me you are going to have access to this set of slides. So you will have this link. The easy way to find us also is just go to the educators page at GED.com, and I type accommodations in the search bar, and then I scroll down to where I see about test accommodations, click on that, and that will give you all of the information you need. It gives you the documentation guidelines for those 4 buckets of accommodated categories we talked about. So there's a separate list of documentation guidelines for ADHD, and there's a separate one for learning disorders and so on. So it's a great place to find information. I put this slide up just to show you this is Minnesota accommodation request volume so far for the year, January through July. So you have had 21 candidates that have had approved or partially approved accommodations. So partially approved would be someone that asks for extra time and a calculator. Well, GED testing service says everyone cannot use a calculator for the first, I think it's 5 questions of the GED test, but after that, everyone can use a calculator. So they do not allow a calculator. So that would be a partial approval. We approve the time, we don't approve the calculator because GED doesn't allow it. So that would go in this category of partially approved. Incomplete, there were 6 candidates that their documentation was found incomplete. Often these are candidates that just don't send in anything at all that can help us. For example, one that happens fairly frequently is candidates will send us a notification from Social Security. I'm sure you've seen those that just says candidate's name is eligible for Social Security benefits. And, while that is helpful information for us, that doesn't tell us anything about what disabling condition they have, what their functional limitations are. So we find a file like that incomplete. My team writes a personalized note on the letter that's sent to the candidate and explains to them what additional documentation is needed. And then we send that back to them. If there is an advocate that's listed, they get a copy as well so that they can assist their candidate with getting the information that they need to be able to then resubmit, goes back into review, and then hopefully at that point, we can approve their accommodations. So just a couple of things about our accommodation systems. Accommodation requests go into our online request system. candidates go to GED.com and they'll get the link there to apply for accommodations. If any of you have been around for a very long time, like I have, you remember the day when we actually mailed requests into GED, and then we went to faxing and we faxed requests in, and I worked in the field back in that day, and I would fax it, and then I would feel kind of helpless because I wasn't sure where it went and if somebody received it. So the new world is the candidate requests accommodations by making a file in the online request system and submitting their documentation there. Once they click the submit button at the end of the application process, they get an immediate email saying, hello, we've gotten your request. We are starting to process it. It will take up to 30 days to get a decision. So that's 30 calendar days. We almost without exception do them in less than 30 days, but we do have a timeline. It, you know, sometimes when it's really busy, it gets close to that 30-day timeline. That being said, I do want to share with you, if you have a candidate who, I don't know, is moving to another state or has some impending surgery, and gosh, they just need to take one more module, and you know that they need accommodations for that for whatever reason, submit the request, but then reach out to me directly and say, hey, Debbie, this is the situation on this candidate. Is there anything you can do to push that request through? Now, I cannot do it for every request, so I ask you to be really conscious of those that you ask, but I will trust that if you have one that you need to be expedited, you know that it needs to be, and you're asking for us to do that. That request needs to come to me directly, and either I'll personally do it myself, or I'll send it to one of my my reviewers and ask them if they can do it in the next day or two. Those things happen. So we want to be, you know, respectful of the fact that life happens, and if there is a way, any way that we can help in these extenuating circumstances, we want to do that. So keep that in mind. And then the other thing is web scheduling. So if candidates have an accommodation approval that does not require manual intervention, so for example, extra time and breaks, those the candidate can go into their GED.com account and they can web schedule their appointment even with accommodations. The times that they cannot do that and do have to call in, first of all, that will be on their approval letter. So their instructions, if they can web schedule, will tell them to go to GED.com to schedule. If they cannot web schedule, and that would be if they need a reader and or a recorder, or if they need a separate room. Those are kind of the two big areas where they do have to call in. Those candidates on their letter will be given the 800 number to phone in to schedule their appointment. I will tell you, it usually is not a one-call resolution. The information is given to the call center agent, and then the call center agent has to do site research to find a site that has a separate room available for a candidate, or they have to work with our third-party vendor to be able to find, to get the third party to find a reader and or recorder for the candidate. And that takes a few days to find that for scheduling. So those kinds of scheduling requests, I just want to set the right expectation with your student. they will not get first call resolution. And it's just because of the research that has to be done to make that happen.
Debbie, I'm
Yes. Oh, perfect.
just wondering if we can stop and
Yes.
take some questions here.
Yes.
I know one of them was, can a regular family doctor write the letter?
Sometimes it depends on what the disabling condition is, but if the doctor is qualified to diagnose whatever that situation is, yes, the family doctor could. What happens sometimes is a family doctor will say, I know that Debbie has a specific learning disability and she should have extra time on her test. Well, my primary care doctor didn't do any testing and doesn't have the right credentials to diagnose me with a learning disability. So that's kind of the difference there, but good question.
Okay, and then another one is, what are the top 5 accommodations granted?
Yeah, so the 4 that I talked about earlier, though, I mean, those are really the ones, right? The 3 times, the separate room, the reader recorder. Those are the top ones, and breaks.
Perfect. And once a tester is granted an accommodation, does that follow them for all of their tests in the series? So each time they schedule, it will automatically give them the accommodation.
Great question. I think I just passed over that in my mind. Thank you for asking that, whoever asked that. The accommodation approval is valid for a year, and it is for all modules of the exam, unless, and it happens so rarely, but should a candidate only have a math disability and the documentation is such that the accommodation approval is for math only, for example, but that's a very rare occasion where that happens. Generally, there's some kind of a learning disability going on that we approve extra time for all 4 modules of the test. So after the 1 year, there is a simple process to request an extension, and the approval then can be extended for another year in most cases. You know, we have some of those physical ones where we would want new documentation, but usually an extension is filed, and it's a pretty easy process for us to approve those. Okay.
And I know Lindsay did post a success story about one of her former learners who was legally blind and was able to earn their GED with accommodations. I know Chelsea from Minnesota DOC is asking, can you please let DOC folks know how their students can get their requests submitted?
Yes. So maybe we could talk offline. I'll give you the high level, but I'd be happy for you to reach out and let's have a conversation about that. Probably no surprise to everyone, candidates who are incarcerated don't have access to the internet, right? And so those requests do need to be submitted using paper request forms. And we have those tucked away in the corrections section at GED.com. So if you go to GED.com and search corrections, you'll get to the corrections page. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom of the corrections page, you will find the paper request forms, and you can use those. If you still use a facsimile machine, you can fax that request form and documentation to us, or you can email it to us if that works better for you. So that's kind of the short version, but please reach out to me and we can talk some more about that.
Okay, another question, Debbie, is does the student get the information from a doctor and upload it to their computer and then download it to you, or does the doctor send something directly to GED?
No, almost without exception, the doctor gives it to the candidate, and the candidate Sometimes they upload it to their computer and then send it to us. Sometimes they just take a picture of it on their phone and they upload it that way. We get documentation a lot of different ways.
Okay. And then that question was from Jean. Jean's also asking, is there a tutorial students and family members can watch, showing them what they can do throughout the accommodations process?
Yes, actually, my team has one. You'll have my email again at the end of the session. Send me an email and I can forward that help doc to you. It's 15 pages or so, kind of a step-by-step how to apply for accommodations. I think you would find it helpful. Yeah, I'd be happy to share that. We send that when candidates or advocates write to us. Our box is simply accommodations@ged.com, but you'll see that again at the end. If they have a difficult time figuring out how to submit a request, then we send this documentation to them. So, but I'm happy to share that.
Okay. And then another question is, the language on the GED website makes it seem like the diagnosis needs to be within 5 years, but current wait times are 7 months long. If there has been an older diagnosis, but a current doctor note, does that count?
You know, it's difficult to say. I would say, and I do write to people and say it's difficult to speculate until we see what you have. You know, I can't say definitively because I don't know what the doctor's note is going to say. I can say, please submit what you have. I understand wait times, particularly for psychologists, are long right now. I also know that. So submit what you have and please let us take a look. And, you know, you can certainly put a note with it as well and acknowledge that the documentation is old. You've included an updated letter from a doctor. The current wait time is 7 months to get a new appointment. And we can certainly look at what is there and take all of that into consideration. And we do our very best to try and find some nugget that we can use to approve.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
Jean asks, do requests for accommodations generally come from teachers or someone else?
Often they come from, well, I guess that's a really good question. You know, as the manager of the department, I see a subset of them, but I don't see them all. I was going to say most often they come from the test taker, but in many situations, there's an advocate behind the test taker, right? That's encouraging and assisting. And so the request itself has to be in the name of the candidate. So I couldn't submit something under my name for a candidate. The request form itself has to be in the candidate's name, and then they might list me as an advocate, which means I'm somebody that my team could reach out to if there are questions.
Okay. And Debbie, so we have 6 minutes left. I don't know how many slides you have.
I know.
Continue
How
with
did this happen? Can I keep going?
I think you should. And then I know there was a question from Amy, but Amy, I'm going to encourage you to reach out to Debbie separately to get that question answered.
Yeah. So just quickly here on assistive technology, the GED test has color contrast, enlarged font, and you know, available on the screen, available to all test takers, does not require an accommodation. There is magnification called Zoom text if candidates need larger magnification than what is available to all candidates. Zoom text does require an accommodation request. And JAWS is speech reading technology. So that would be for candidates who are blind. Many of them they have to be proficient JAWS users. But if they are proficient JAWS users, they can request the test in JAWS. Blind candidates can also request a Braille version, there is a Braille version of the test, or a reader recorder. And then adaptive equipment, if candidates need an ergonomic keyboard or a special mouse, we have all of that equipment. If their documentation supports that, we actually, you do it like a lending library. We ship it directly to the test center. The test center has it ready when the candidate arrives, they use the equipment, and then it's shipped back to us. So emerging trends, I'm going to just speak to the one here, an accommodation versus a fundamental alteration. We have many, many candidates who ask for reduced number of answer choices. They ask for an easier test. That has seemed to be a really popular request lately. I want the slimmed down version of the test. You know, I assure everyone that everyone must take and pass the same test, but we can help with accommodations such as extra time. So that's all I'm going to say here. My team is a team of professionals that reviews every single request. I've already talked about how we send notes to the candidate in their determination letter if it has to be found incomplete, with recommendations on what they need to do. Most importantly, how you can help your students. If you go to GED.com and to the accommodation page, you will find something called comfort aids. Comfort aids are things that candidates can bring to the testing center that do not require prior approval. They can also be used for online testing. So things like a little stool, if a candidate has a broken foot or something else and they need to prop their foot up, it's on that list. So take a look at that list. Those are things you could tell your candidate, yeah, you could bring that to the test with you. It's subject to verbal inspection, but you could take it with you. There's also there a list of lower cost testing clinics. That whole thing about, you know, how do we pay for an evaluation? There are lower cost testing clinics. I would encourage you to work with programs in your communities. Sometimes the Lions or the Shriners or other community agencies are willing to help, because if your student can get their GED, they are more likely to make a family sustaining wage. And so if you can sell it that way to some of these organizations, they might be willing to say, well, yeah, we could support some testing for some of your students. Encourage starting the process early. Again, requests or approvals are valid for a whole year. So, you know, as soon as you know a candidate might need accommodations, help them get that paperwork in, and then the approval can just sit there until they're ready. And I'm going on quickly. Some things that are outer limits: an untimed test. All the tests have to be timed. 100% extra time is the most. We've already talked waiving a portion of the test or reduced answer choices. Administering medical care, we cannot allow our test administrators to administer medical care, but we can approve a candidate to bring someone with them, a personal care attendant, to tend to those kinds of needs for them. Resources, questions. Oh, we have 1 minute. And here's that last one with the contact information. I'm sorry, we did answer a lot of questions though, so hopefully that was helpful. I encourage you, if you had other questions, please reach out to me directly, debbie.berktholt@pearson.com. It's 2 o'clock, I have to end. I want to thank Lindsay and the whole group for inviting me today, and I look forward to hearing from you. Lindsay, back to you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. This is amazing. And I want to make sure you see my comment. I appreciate the humanness behind this process so much. So thank you to you and your team. So I will stop the recording, but if people have some questions, Debbie, I don't know if you're able to stay for a couple minutes. This room, you're able to use this room for a few more minutes if there are additional questions that we want to talk about.
Melissa, are you able to stay for a little minute?